He stood alone at the gates. No cameras pointed his way. No one asked his name. To most people there, he was just an old man in a worn uniform holding a single wilted flower. But to one person, he was everything. This is Soul Story, where we don't just honor medals, we honor the men who never asked for one. It was a cloudy morning at Highland Ridge National Cemetery in Colorado, the kind of morning where the wind moves like it remembers something. The funeral was about to begin. Not just any funeral, but a full military honor service for General Richard Allen, a 4-star legend. Flags everywhere, rows of medals, dozens of polished black cars rolling up like a presidential motorcade. Security was tight. Military IDs, retina scans, guest lists that had been checked and rechecked. No one got in unless they were somebody. And that's why the man at the gate didn't belong. He didn't carry a camera or a clipboard. He didn't wear the sharp blues of active duty. His jacket was old, olive green, faded at the seams, buttons dulled by time. There were no stripes on his shoulders, no decorations across his chest. Just a quiet presence and a single cloth-wrapped white lily in his hand. When he walked up to the entrance, a young guard stepped forward. "I'm sorry, sir. This is a restricted area, military clearance only." The old man paused. His eyes were pale and cloudy, but still sharp in a way that made you look twice. "I'm not here for the ceremony," he said softly. "Just came to pay my respects." "Are you family?" He shook his head. "We served together, long ago." The guard's posture didn't change. "I'm really sorry, sir, without credentials." The old man didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't even sigh. He just nodded once, stepped aside, and stood near the outer wall. Just close enough to hear the music when it began. Far enough that no one noticed him. Except one man did. Inside the tent, just as the honor guard was forming ranks, Colonel Jacob Reeve glanced toward the gate. Something about that old jacket caught his eye. Something about that lone stance. And then he saw the patch on the shoulder. Barely visible, but unmistakable. A jagged eagle holding a lightning bolt, stitched in faded thread. Echo Unit, Sierra Division. A recon group that officially never existed. The kind of unit whispered about in hallways, but never written into the books. Colonel Reeve leaned in toward the man standing just behind the flag-draped casket. "Sir," he whispered, "I think he's here." General Samuel Price, the man the press had come to see, the one everyone called a living war legend, turned slowly. "Who?" "Marshall," Reeve replied. "The one who saved your life in '72. The general froze. Without a word, he handed off his saber, adjusted the cuffs of his ceremonial coat, and began walking. Not toward the podium, not toward the media line, but straight down the center aisle, past generals, past senators, past the Secretary of Defense. Every head turned. The music stopped. Even the breeze seemed to pause. And then the most powerful man on that field walked outside the gates. The old man looked up, startled, when the general stopped just 3 feet from him. General Price stood tall, his voice low but firm. "Sergeant Marshall Quinn," he said, saluting sharply, "we've been waiting for you." The old man blinked. "You don't have to do this." "With all due respect, Sergeant, yes I do." He motioned to his aide, who stepped forward with a polished wooden box. An urn, dark cherry wood with gold trim. The ashes of General Richard Allen. "His final request," Price said quietly, "was for you to bring him home." Marshall's hands trembled as he reached out. For a long moment, he just stared at the box, then finally said, so softly it almost disappeared in the breeze, "I thought they forgot." The general's voice cracked. "We didn't." And behind them, a row of men began to rise, some in uniform, some barely able to stand without help. Old warriors, brothers in arms, Echo Unit. Each one brought to his feet by something more powerful than orders, memory. They saluted Marshall Quinn, not because of a rank, not because of protocol, but because they remembered. As Sergeant Marshall Quinn stepped through the gates, the cemetery transformed. The rows of polished brass and ribbons seemed to fade behind him. All that remained was the silence, not empty, not cold, but the kind that carries weight, the kind that feels like someone finally exhaled after holding their breath for years. The general didn't say anything more. He simply walked beside Marshall, shoulder to shoulder, down the gravel path toward the central platform. No cameras followed, no press dared to interrupt. Just two men, one in a spotless ceremonial uniform, the other in a coat older than most of the officers present, carrying the remains of a falling brother. Marshall held the urn with a steadiness that didn't come from youth or strength. It came from something deeper, the kind that calm you only earn when you've seen things that never make it into stories. They reached the service canopy, and everything stopped. General Price turned to Marshall, gently nodded, and stepped back. Marshall walked the final few feet alone. He placed the urn on the stand just above the folded flag. Not because it was part of the program, because it was what Richard would have wanted. As he backed away, hands trembling just slightly, his mind was already somewhere else, not on the marble stones or the rows of officers in their Sunday best, but in a place long gone, in a jungle half a world away. It was spring 1972, a brutal operation deep in the northern borderlands. Sierra Division's Echo Unit had been on recon for over 2 weeks. No contact, no backup, just maps and instincts. They were ghosts on paper. And that night, everything had gone wrong. The ambush hit just before dusk. The first explosion took out their comms. The second split the unit in two. By the time the dust settled, 3 men were dead, 2 injured, and Lieutenant Richard Allen was pinned behind a collapsed hill bunker, clutching a shattered rifle and bleeding from a head wound. Marshall had already run through half his ammo. He was the senior enlisted left, and there was no chain of command anymore, just survival. He could have waited, could have fallen bad, but he didn't. He crawled through thick jungle under sniper fire, dragged Richard out by the straps of his vest, and shielded him with his own body until the evac came in hot and low 2 hours later. He didn't speak, didn't celebrate. He just lit a cigarette, checked the rest of the line, and carried on. Richard never forgot, even after becoming a general, even after the awards and the speeches and the parades. He carried one name in his pocket, and in the final months of his life, he left one instruction. If Marshall's still alive, I want him to bring me home. That was the letter General Price had found. And that's why, now, at the most prestigious military funeral of the year, the cameras were lowered, the guests stood silently. Not for a 4-star general, but for a man who had never been interviewed, never been thanked publicly, never wanted the spotlight. Because Marshall Quinn wasn't a hero the world remembered. He was a hero who had never been forgotten by those who mattered. Under the canopy, a young lieutenant approached nervously, clipboard in hand. "Excuse me, sir, are you part of the family?" Marshall didn't flinch. He simply answered in a steady voice. "Echo Unit, Sierra Division, Northern Recon, 1972. The young officer blinked, confused. I don't see that listed." Marshall gave a tired smile. "You wouldn't." And he stepped aside, letting the silence do the explaining. Across the field, General Price had seen the exchange. He didn't speak. He didn't ask permission. He just walked straight up to the microphone meant for the keynote speaker. No notes, no speech, just truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice clear and low, "there are people in this world whose names never reach headlines, whose faces don't appear in documentaries, but without them, none of us would be standing here." He turned to Marshall, extended a hand. If not for this man, he continued, General Richard Allen would have died at 19. I would never have survived my first tour. And the careers, the missions, the lives touched by those who followed us, they never would have existed. The silence was thick. And then it broke. Not with applause, not with music, but with respect. One by one, soldiers rose to their feet. Veterans in wheelchairs, young cadets, secretaries in tailored suits. They stood. They saluted, not because protocol required it, but because they understood what had just happened. A forgotten warrior had come home. Marshall didn't speak. He didn't cry. He didn't even smile. He just stood there as every uniform in the field turned toward him. Not the urn, not the general, not the rank, but him. A man whose story had almost never been told. A man who, for over 50 years, had carried the weight of a moment no one else ever saw. And now, finally, someone was standing beside him to say, "We remember." General Price turned from the microphone, walked back to Marshall, and asked just loud enough for the closest few to hear, "Will you walk with me, Sergeant?" Marshall looked at him for a moment, not as a general, not as a four-star leader of men, but as a boy he once dragged out of a firestorm. Then he nodded once. Together, side by side, they began the final walk down the central path, the general on one side, the sergeant on the other. The urn held steady in Marshall's arms. The crowd parted in silence. Soldiers came to attention. Civilians lowered their heads. Reporters put down their cameras. No one dared narrate what was happening, because you don't capture a moment like that. You just feel it. As they approached the final row of seated guests, the honor guard split with perfect precision, forming a corridor of stillness. Marshall climbed the steps alone and placed the urn at the center of the platform, directly above the folded flag. Not because it was required, but because it was right. Then he stepped back, arms to his side, head held high, and for a moment the entire field was silent. No wind, no chatter, just breath held in the air. And in that space, something shifted. Because for the first time since the war, Marshall Quinn wasn't invisible. He was honored. As the ceremony concluded, the final notes of the bugler's taps echoed across the hills. There were no speeches left, no eulogies to deliver, no fanfare to fill the silence, just the weight of memory, and a man who carried it longer than most. Marshall stood still beside the platform, his hand lightly resting on the urn. The same hand that once pulled a young officer through jungle fire was now holding him in death. Then, as the crowd began to shift and families moved toward reception lines, Marshall stepped down from the platform, slowly, deliberately, and something remarkable happened. On either side of the walkway, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, young and old, everyone rose. Not for the casket, for him. Some saluted sharp, others, older, with hands that shook. A few just stood with hats pressed over their hearts, tears running down cheeks lined with decades of sacrifice. But none looked away. It was no longer a funeral for a general. It was a homecoming for a brother. As Marshall walked that final path, every person stood in silence. Even the civilians felt it, something unspoken, heavy, sacred. Not a celebration, not a spectacle, just a quiet, universal agreement. This man matters. By the time he reached the family section, the entire field had risen. The press lowered their lenses. No one asked questions. No one needed to. In the center of that sacred space, surrounded by rows of decorated officers, marble stones, and waving flags, Marshall Quinn, the man who never wanted recognition, was now the most honored soul in that field. He didn't bow. He didn't wave. He just kept walking, one step at a time. until he reached the final marker, where the man he once saved now waited to rest in peace. Long after the final hymn faded and the guests drifted toward their cars, Marshall remained. He stood beneath a tall oak tree, where the sunlight broke through in quiet patches. The ceremony was over, but for him, the real goodbye hadn't begun yet. The headstone was simple, no elaborate inscription, no grand message, just Richard Allen, brother, commander, friend. Marshall knelt beside the fresh grave. His knees cracked like old hinges, but he didn't flinch. From the inside pocket of his jacket, he pulled out a small stick of incense. Nothing military about it, just something personal, quiet, a ritual no one else needed to understand. He lit it, let the smoke drift upward into the wind. It curled like memory itself, soft, rising, disappearing into the air. He didn't speak loudly, but if anyone had been close enough, they might have heard the words as they floated into the silence. "I told you I'd make it." A pause, a faint smile. "You always did hate flowers." Then, after a long breath, a final whisper. "Rest easy, kid." He bowed his head once, then slowly rose to his feet. But before he could turn to leave, someone was there, waiting. General Price, still in full ceremonial uniform, though the day had clearly worn heavy on him. His shoulders no longer carried the same sharpness, but his presence, that was still steady. In his hand, he held an envelope. It was smaller than the others passed out that day, yellowed at the edges, handwritten, no official seal. He extended it to Marshall with both hands, like it carried something far more delicate than paper. "This was in Richard's safe," Price said quietly. "He left it with instructions, said to give it to you only if you made it." Marshall didn't move for a moment. Then he slowly took the envelope, his fingers brushing the worn edge. The flap was already unsealed, like it had waited too long to be opened. Inside was a single page.
"Frank, you never let me thank you. Not really. You saved my life and disappeared like it didn't matter. But it mattered to me. You're the only debt I carried that no medal, no command, no ceremony could repay. You let me live long enough to serve, to lead, to die at peace. And if there's any justice in this world, one day they'll say my name beside yours. Maybe then I'll finally feel worthy. Your friend, me." Marshall folded the letter slowly, pressed it against his chest, then slid it back into the envelope and tucked it into his jacket. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said softly. Price nodded. "I know," he replied. "That's why you deserve it." A year passed. Spring came again, warm and clean. On the edge of a quiet town, a crowd had gathered under the sun. Veterans in worn jackets, young soldiers in dress uniform, families holding small flags in their hands. They stood before a stone archway carved with bold bronze letters. "The Marshall Quinn Center, a place for those who carry the quiet wars." It was more than a building. It was a sanctuary, a space for those who came home from war with no visible scars, but with wounds no less real. PTSD therapy, reintegration programs, a small wood shop, a garden lined with names never printed in history books. It was built by the Richard Allen Legacy Foundation, approved personally by General Price, and funded in part by men who had once thought no one would ever remember them. The ribbon stretched across the entrance. A line of local officials prepared to cut it, the press standing by, ready for a speech from the man whose name was now etched in stone. But Marshall Quinn wasn't at the podium. He stood quietly at the edge of the crowd,
a dark coat over his shoulders, hands clasped behind his back, and in one hand, a single white lily. Its petals faded, its stem wrapped in a strip of cloth, but he held it like it still meant everything. No one pointed cameras at him, no one called him to the stage. Only a few veterans in the crowd turned, nodded slowly in his direction. They knew. That center didn't exist because someone wanted glory. It existed because someone never stopped remembering. As the ceremony wound down, General Price walked over, quietly. No guards, no fanfare, just a man walking up to a friend. "I told you I didn't want a building," Marshall muttered, still watching the new doors open. Price gave the faintest grin. "It's not a building." Marshall raised a brow. "No?" "It's a thank you," Price said, etched in stone. They both looked at the center, watched a young soldier, just barely 20, walk through the front doors for the first time. "You think they'll come?" Marshall asked, voice low. Price followed his gaze. "They already have." The sun dipped low behind the trees as Marshall turned to leave. No speeches, no spotlights, just quiet footsteps moving away. But something had changed. Not in him, in the world around him. People didn't stare anymore. They nodded, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Because somewhere in this country, one old man in a faded uniform still carried the kind of debt no one else could see. And finally, so did the nation he never stopped serving. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Soul Story, where the quietest heroes are never forgotten and every memory has a voice.